Her research interests include transitions, power and transport sector decarbonization, supply chain security. Previously at Brookings India, now CSEP, she managed and co-edited the book The Next Stop: Natural Gas and India's Journey to a Clean Energy Future, which puts together a roadmap to increase gas consumption in India. So Ms. Swati was also associated with the Energy and Resources Institute TERI, where she led the research on fossil fuels and transitions in India's electricity sector to renewable energy. Thank you. Ma'am, you can share your screen and start.
Okay, thank you. Are we waiting for more people or should I just start?
We can start, ma'am.
Okay, sure. Sorry, 1 second. Is my screen visible to everybody?
Yes, ma'am, it is.
Okay, so just to as the world continues on its decarbonization pathway, it is useful to understand the sources of this global movement, right, which is rising carbon dioxide emissions coming from different sources. If you look at the chart on the left, per capita emissions in India have remained low by international standards, but 14% of the global energy sector emissions growth since 1990 has nevertheless come from India. India's energy sector related CO2 emissions sorry, have more than doubled, have more than quadrupled since 1990, with major sources of emissions growth being power sector generation, industry and transport. Emissions growth from power generation over this period has been nearly twice total emissions from all sectors in 1990. Coal meets 45% of India's primary energy demand, but is responsible for 70% of India's energy sector CO2 emissions. The carbon intensity of India's power sector is 725 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, compared with the global average of 510 grams of CO2 per kWh, underlining the predominant role of inefficient coal-fired generation. After power generation, the next highest emitting sector is industry. India provides just over 6% of steel production globally, and iron and steel sector is the largest industrial subsector in terms of emissions. It is responsible for around 30% of India's industrial energy consumption. Coal provides around 85% of the energy used for iron and steel, and the sector makes relatively little use of recycled scrap. This means that India's steel industry is more emissions intensive than its counterparts in many other countries. India provides 8% of global cement production, and this is the second largest emitting industrial subsector. Although coal and oil are the main fuels used to provide heat for its cement industry, a number of energy efficiency measures have been introduced at Indian cement plants, and total emissions, including indirect emissions from the use of electricity, per ton of production are nearly 15% lower in India than in China. Oil demand for road freight transport in India has tripled since 2000. This is the highest after China. More than 45% of emissions from road transport in India come from trucks. India's heavy freight trucks have relatively high level of fuel consumption per ton kilometer compared with other countries. But the implementation of new engine standards in 2020 should help reduce emissions intensity of activity in the future. Emissions from passenger road transport in India have also quadrupled since 2000. India has a high share of two and three wheeler vehicles in its vehicle fleet. And this helps to explain why passenger vehicles in India account for only 18% of overall transport emissions. The direct use of fossil fuels in the building sector resulted in just over 160 million tons of CO2 emissions in 2019, with a further 460 of indirect emissions coming from use of electricity. India has been seeking to improve energy efficiency of its buildings through mandatory building energy codes and voluntary rating schemes. This is just to provide a lay of the landscape when it comes to the energy sector decarbonization and the policies that India has been following. So when it comes to some of the features of what our energy transition program is, one these include policy support, institutional governance structures, investment and support for alternate fuels and industries, people and communities welfare, financing and global cooperation and learning. For example, in the power sector, we have the RE target of 450 gigawatts by 2030, which is an impetus towards our net zero emissions by 2070. In the transport sector, schemes such as PLI, which is the production linked incentive scheme, FAME, at the national level have pushed EV policies and EV penetration. This coupled with EV policies in 28, 29 states in the country have also pushed the transition in the transport sector. The green hydrogen policy, which came up, which was announced in January 2023, also is aimed at supporting decarbonization of the transport when it comes of the transport sector, particularly in particularly in long distance freight and in heavy industries such as steel and cement. Now, the graph on the left essentially are different measures or different types of policy of things that are needed when we think of transition in India from coal and fossil fuel based electricity and energy systems to clean energy systems. This is just a brief overview of the power sector. So today, based on the last 5 years, that's the chart on the left. This is the RE capacity additions that we've been seeing since 2018. If we need to meet 450 gigawatts by 2030, these additions are not enough. As you can see from the chart on the left, we need at a minimum of 31.3 gigawatts from now till 2030 if we have to meet our ambitions of 450 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030. The chart on the right shows the electricity sector mix as we transition towards from fossil fuels to clean. The share of renewable energy in 2050 when it comes to the total electricity sector changes based on the scenarios that we account for. Now, these scenarios, STEPS, APS, and STS, are part of the larger scenario mix at the International Energy Agency. STEPS essentially indicates current policy trajectory. APS, on the other hand, looks at all our ambitions across different sectors, including the net zero ambition by 2070, to understand the kind of mix that is going to come in the system by 2050. STS, which is similar to the NZE scenario, looks at what is required for India to transition away from fossil fuels to clean energy to meet its net zero pathway. So the first two scenarios essentially is a bottom-up calculation. The last scenario is a top-down based assumptions in the system. So given that coal provides the bulk of our energy sector needs, we need to understand why coal transitions matter to India. So in this, the way the lecture is designed is the first part of the lecture talks about the impact of coal transitions from a people and communities welfare position under the larger research theme of just transition. The second part of the lecture looks at financing challenges. The third part of this lecture looks at transport related challenges, including supply chain. So, in India, if we look at the characteristics of the Indian economy, what we realize is transitions are very closely linked to the impact that it's going to have on the labor force. Given the fact that most of our workers come from the informal sector, and agriculture has the largest share in the labor force, it becomes very important for us when we think of transitions to take along the worker and consider the kind of impact it's going to have on the current existing characteristics of the labor force. The reason why this chart is important is to understand. So, if you look at the monthly income from agriculture, which is around 99 euros or 8,000 rupees per month, in comparison to fossil fuel sector, even such as coal, where your monthly income comes to close to about 12 to 15,000, and this is in the contract worker side of things. This if you compare this to regular salaried income in urban and in rural areas, we realize that fossil fuel based industries are very close to providing are on the higher side of monthly income as compared to other sectors, which also makes it important to when we think about transitions. This is very briefly how global coal transitions have taken place. So, under the larger just transitions ambit, there are about five key pillars. One is to understand who is going to be impacted. So, this includes defining coal workers, affected communities, regions. In India, it's largely on the central and eastern part of the country where most of your coal mines are located, where most of your steel plants are iron and steel plants are located, where the bulk of your thermal power plants are also located. Then the next idea is to look at what will be the impact. So, what is the financial and the economic cost of transition that we need to take into account? It's going to include the wages, your current wages for the workers, any reskilling or upskilling packages that we will need to provide, compensation in terms of voluntary benefits. This is just for workers. On the asset side, it's about providing enough resources for the company owners, be it private players, be it central PSUs, be it private sector or the state government, to transition away. Then it's to understand what is going to be the need of the region in terms of for economic diversification. What are the kinds of industries that are going to be in place, and what are the financial incentives that we need to provide to different sectors to invest in this region. Then comes the question of how to fund the transition. Now, in different countries, the first process has been in how to fund the transition, has been to understand the impact of the transition and look at what your existing allocations and policies are under which current funds can be used. In India, for example, the first layer of funding is the district mineral fund, under which can be repurposed for certain areas when it comes to coal transition. Then it's to try and understand how much of these funds can be leveraged from international sources through climate finance. So, a number of the JETP deals that happen in South Africa and Indonesia and Vietnam is part of this analysis to understand what is going to be the global funding sources. Um, then it's to understand how the domestic finance institutions can be leveraged to provide funding to some of the transition activities. How to govern the transition comes again is a very important structure, particularly in a country like India, where a lot of your decisions related to energy transitions or energy sector are taken at the central level, whereas the implementation of it actually happens at the state level. Sorry, I can't see my screen. Has there been? Uh,
Yes, ma'am. Your
oh,
screen.
I Okay, okay. Sorry, I was for a second not sure.
Okay.
Uh, It's still full screen, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so from the Indian perspective, a lot of the impact happens on the state level, be it unemployment, be it impact on social sector schemes because of the funding that is that fossil fuels provides the state government. Uh, Given this, it's important to understand how to govern this transition. What is the impact that we're going to have on? Sorry, 1 second. What is the impact that we are going to have on the communities, how to sort of take the communities who are fearful of job losses alongside uh, us when we look at coal transitions, which leads us to the last pillar, which is how to build consensus. So, in a number of countries, essentially the analytical framework has started from building bottom-up consensus, getting industries at the local level, industry associations, communities, and local municipal corporations involved in this planning process. So this is a very brief idea of what is the coal sector as a glance. We are the India is the second largest producer and consumer of coal. Our main consuming sector is essentially power, followed by steel, sponge iron, and bricks, which is part of the MSME sector. From a per capita coal consumption, we are at the lowest, especially if we look at other countries. 77% of our coal comes from domestic sources, 23% comes from imports as of FY21. Now, if we think about coal sector transitions and if we look at the value chain for coal sector transitions includes the power sector, coal mining, and from the power sector, it comes to steel plants, sponge iron plants, and the brick sector, right? So, if you look at the map of India, on the three different maps of India. One, it tells you the state-wise distribution, including captive coal in every state, the distribution of steel plants and the distribution of sponge iron plants. Why is sponge iron important? Because India is the only country in the world that uses non-coking coal to produce sponge iron using the DRI process, from which steel is produced. About 28 to 30% of our domestic steel production comes from sponge iron, from the DRI-based sponge iron. Which also is the reason why when we think of coal transitions in hard to abate sectors like industries, we need to consider not just the technology, which is BFPOF, but also look at DRI production sources. So from a coal mining perspective, what we see is the most impacted states are going to be Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Odisha, and Madhya Pradesh, where you see 80% of your coal production coming from a sponge iron and steel sector. 40% of the 1,500 or so units come from Odisha, are based in Odisha, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, and West Bengal. You do have units in Tamil Nadu, but these are essentially less than 1 million ton units. So a transition is also likely to see consolidation within the iron and steel sector because a number of your micro and small enterprises often won't have the capital when it comes to transition to clean technologies for the production of steel. When it comes to the power sector, UP, Maharashtra, MP, Chhattisgarh are some of the key areas where you have thermal power plants. A lot of these are actually in the radius of 100 and 200 kilometers away from coal mines, which also means that when we think of transition from a value chain perspective, transport will play a key factor, or the impact on transport will also be a key factor. Now, if we do a further deep dive and look at some of the districts that have been, which are highly vulnerable to the transition, what this map essentially shows you is if we look at the capacity of your different unit sizes across mines, power, and iron and steel. And if we look at the age of these plants, so capacity with the age of the plant mapped with your current existing policies on different across all three, four of these sectors, what we realize is that a lot of the highly vulnerable districts are not your current big districts when it comes to coal mining. um, the most amount of transition will, or the most amount of impact of the transition may happen in some of the largest districts, which is your least vulnerable districts, but this is more or less 20-25 years down the line. Your existing districts, which is your first two indicators, which is the highly vulnerable districts and the moderate vulnerable districts, are the ones where we will see the first impact of the transition happening. These districts invariably either have coal mines which are exhausted or thermal power plants which are more than 25 years old, which will end up facing closure, or they have iron and steel plants which is less than 1 million ton, which may not be able to transition away from coal. Um, from a labor perspective, close to about 13 million people are employed across the coal supply chain. Now, these are very conservative estimates. The reason for this is because this analysis only looks at the formal sector and the contract labor within which straddle this boundary between formal and informal. It does not look at the informal sector. It does not look at the induced sectors or the induced impact due to coal transition. Right now, if we have to understand the way labor in the energy sector in India is structured, there are about four or five different categories. The first category of the labor force essentially is the formal sector workers, which are employed by Coal India and other mining companies. These are workers who are on the payroll. They have pensionable jobs. They are part of the 2.5 lakh workers that if you open any Coal India annual report that you will end up seeing. Then you have something called the contract workers, but these are departmental contract workers. Essentially, what this means is every coal company ends up hiring a certain number of contract workers who may be eligible for pension, but their employment comes with a fixed tenure. Now, these are directly hired by the individual coal companies. Then you have something called the contract workers by job tenders. Now, a lot of times there are certain parts of the coal supply chain and value chain that are outsourced to contractors. So, in a coal mining uh, uh, in a coal mining colliery, for example, uh, parts such as overburden removal or transportation of coal from the from the mine to the dispatch point, or from the dispatch point onto, say, railway wagons. These are jobs that are often outsourced to different contractors. Now, these contractors end up hiring labor now who may or may not have a long-term contract with these contractors, because their salaries are often determined based on the amount of payload that they have transferred within a day. So perhaps if you're thinking about it from a overburden operator perspective, it's the quantity of overburden that's been transported from the mine to the overburden dump site, or the amount of coal that's been filled in a railway wagon. If we have to consider now this if we have to consider this on the thermal power plant side, a lot of these are the O&M workers that work in your coal handling unit or your ash handling unit. In an iron and steel plant, these are often job contracts for civil works that are outsourced to different contractors. Now, the reason why we need to consider these people is because they don't come under any official statistics that India has. Even when we look at the annual reports by each of these different companies, none of these workers are actually factored in. PLFS is one database where you can see the number of contract workers or the informal contract workers that are part of the larger coal supply chain and value chain. But there are no, and these are possibly the only official statistics that we have of these people. Um, the The final part of the larger labor force classification also includes the informal workers, who essentially work on your overburden on your burden side. So if you have seen this very famous photo of this labor who has these gonies of coal on and gonies of coal and walking alongside highways. Particularly if you go to West Bengal, Jharkhand, or Chhattisgarh, you'll see a number of these labor that moves across the highways. Now, this is just one visual representation of the labor that works on the commons, on what we call village commons or overburden dump sites as part of the larger informal economy. We don't really know how many of these work, because many times this is not their only job. Their workforce is supplemented by either agriculture or other landless labor activities. Given that, what this 13 million people, now this is your broader supply, broader classification of labor force. Amongst this, the 13 million people across the supply chain only constitute the first three categories, which is your formal sector labor, your contractual labor, which is hired by the companies directly, and jobs which are outsourced to other to job contractors, which is why 13 million is a very conservative estimate of the actual number of people employed within the entire coal value chain. Now, if you look at what is the skill profile that is available with people when we think of transitions. Now, the reason why this is important to understand what is the skill level also is is linked to the socioeconomic characteristics of the labor in India, right? Now, when we think about skill level, as you can see, the chart on the left shows you which is within the labor force in coal mining, how many of this account for which kind of job category, which essentially means that when we think of transitions, which will be the first line of activities that are going to be impacted. So in the coal sector, in the coal mining sector, the pie chart that is on your top left, it is the ancillary and the common workers who are involved in ancillary and other common work and overburden removal, which will be the first impact, which will be the first layer of impact that we will see. In your iron and steel sector, for example, it's those who are going to be on the induction furnace side, which will see the first layer of impact. Even amongst this, there are different categories. For example, those who are involved in handling coal, both at the pithead side, which is the mining side, and at your induction side. These are the people that will be most strongly impacted. When we look at the power sector, again, it's those who are working on O&M that will that will see the first layer of impact, because more often than not, since these are contract jobs, uh, they are not part of the larger retraining and reskilling program that companies take into account. And this is why it's important to understand, a, how many people are going to be impacted, what is the level at which they are going to be impacted, and then develop reskilling programs. Now, each of the sectors and companies, both PSUs and private companies, in each of these sector, barring the BRICS sector, which is largely informal, undertake skilling programs at least like 2 or 3 times a year. NTPC, for example, has skilling programs for its employees who are involved in the thermal power plant to shift over to their green energy arm. But this leaves the contract workers, which is the largest chunk of your labor force, uh, out of the skilling paradigm and out of the skilling needs. Similarly, on the BRICS sector, most of your employees are actually unskilled. Now, because most of them are either semi-skilled or unskilled, the problem that ends up happening is the larger context of the BRICS sector, which is informal in nature. So more often than not, we don't know the number of bricklins that exist in India. The number of bricks the estimation of the number of kilns is often derived from the number of bricks that are produced every year, and this is then divided into your BTK kilns, which is what, or the tandoori, which you see mostly in the northern part of the country, and the induction electric kilns, which is in Karnataka and other parts of the southern part of the country. Um Maximum number of the bricks comes from technologies other than BTK and the tandoor, but the number of BTK and tandoor kilns overshadow any other technology. A large part of this is because they are also informal. So what we understood was the most amount of people in the brick sector often are not employed in the brick sector over a long term. So 6 months in a year they will be working in other sectors, and from December all the way till May, which is when your main brick making season happens, they migrate to these kilns and work in these kilns. Given this kind of mobile workforce, it becomes very very important for India especially to understand how we map our labor, how we target each of the labor within these separate enterprises when we think of reskilling programs for a clean energy labor force. This again now divides what we know by number and skills based on their socio-economic job profile. And what we see to a large extent is there is a considerable section, particularly amongst women in every sector, that is either not literate, but and this is the Indian definition of not literate, which is you can't read, which is you can't sign or read any language, even including your mother tongue, right? So this is again, apart from the labor profiles within each sector, it also breaks down the socioeconomic characteristics between men and women in each of these sectors. Women, of course, have the most amount of contracts which are not written. They are amongst different sectors, the highest number of illiterate women. The illiteracy actually comes from women. Even when we look at what is the section between literate as compared to the rest of the different categories, there are only about 9% of people in this country who are actually graduates, and 3% who are postgraduates within the labor force. Now, sorry, this also tells you that when we think of any reskilling, upskilling programs, we need to take into account the illiteracy within the labor force, and prepare our training programs in that manner. When we think of transitions, we need to think of the nature of job contracts, and what essentially having a contract means in every sector. For example, most of the people who end up working in the coal sector, as you can see, the chart on the right, don't have contracts for less than 3 years. Now, given this status and the transition to renewable energy, the conversation in terms of contracts has been that renewable energy sector jobs, which are often gig jobs, particularly when you're thinking of building an installation of RE capacity in the country, are gig jobs which don't provide social security benefits. But the problem is, even our current workforce does not adequately provide social security benefits. So, how do we define social security benefits in India becomes very important. Minimum wage, we do have contract, we do have a minimum wage that is there in every that is decided by the center, but every state has its own minimum wage. Health benefits, we have a Bima Yojana that comes into account. There are different health insurance packages, both at state and the central level, that are aimed at all population, not just the labor. When it comes to hospitals, there are hospitals in terrible shape, which COVID taught us. But from a policy perspective, there we have the basic social security benefits that is required in India. The challenge comes in how do we implement this, keeping in mind the labor force in question and keeping in mind providing the labor force and improving their access to these benefits. Now, this often is not an energy sector issue, but when it comes to coal transitions and just transitions, it is not it becomes linked to the larger energy sector conversation and transition challenges conversation. So, from the first slide, the broad key takeaways from the first set of the presentation, the broad key takeaways are that the coal transition in India is likely to be uneven across sectors and job profiles. What we see in different sectors don't necessarily align with the larger net zero conversation and target that the Indian government has set in place. The number of permanent pensionable jobs have been decreasing for over a decade, and this has or rather led to an increase in contract or gig economy jobs. So, therefore, a transition to renewable energy will not be new from a gig economy perspective, but it means that we need to start thinking about what are going to be social security benefits that we would like to provide the labor force in India from a new green economy perspective, which leads us to talk about what kind of skilling and reskilling programs we need for the labor, how to target this in urban areas and in rural areas, which have very different requirements going forward, and why we also need to have some baseline data at different levels for us to understand what is going to be the impact of transition. Now, this was on the labor side of it. Now, let us look at the finance side of the transition. Now, from a finance perspective, India currently devotes about 3% of our GDP to energy investment, and an increasing share of this investment is going into clean energy. Now, based on a CW analysis, India will need close to about $10.1 trillion to transition to net zero by 2070. Specifically, the total investment estimated pertains to electricity, generation, integration, transmission, and distribution, hydrogen production, and vehicle manufacturing. Of this 10 trillion, India will need aggregate investments to the tune of 1.4 trillion USD every year, which is an average of 1.4 trillion USD, which is an average of 28 billion per year between now and 2070 to meet our 2070 targets. To meet the growing needs of the transition, there are different avenues in which money can be raised. Now, this is of course based on the graph on the right. Now, what the climate finance or financing the transition actually comes from different sources. This includes debt finance instruments such as green bonds, transition and sustainability linked bonds, equity based financing for projects, multilateral debt funding to de-risk sectors, loans including priority sector lending from domestic banks and other DFIs, and adaptation finance that covers loss and damage. Now, of these instruments, loans, equity based finance, green bonds have been the most utilized, especially for project lending. Bonds are also used as instruments for financing state needs. For example, SEBI's recent initiative to provide an information database and repository on municipal bonds and its recent circular on issuance of green debt securities can be used to identify most appropriate mechanisms for state level entities to access sustainable finance. Now, of these different instruments that we have seen, the most amount of sustainable finance has been raised through the bond market, which is still small in India in comparison to the global bond markets. Now, this is followed by multilateral banks that have come into India to de-risk certain sectors. The last of the instruments, which is your debt financing instruments at the state level, at district level, are the least used sources of finance instruments. Adaptation finance as a package is something that we're still discussing in India. Now, let's take the example of the state of Jharkhand, which is one of India's largest coal mining state, to understand why we need to think about why and how we need to think about clean energy finance from a national level and how the needs differ at the state level. So, just the chart on the left essentially gives you very brief, very some of the highlights of the industry and the mining sector in Jharkhand with respect to its contribution at the state level, right? So, based on a preliminary analysis, what we realized that in revenue terms, industries and mining today contributes to 11% of the GVA, while mining receipts are the second largest contributor to the state exchequer. Now, based on PLF's data in FY19, mining receipts contributed to between 24 to 27% to the non-tax revenue receipts. Now, in addition to this, about 12% came and about 12% to the total revenue receipts. This is, of course, over and above the district mineral fund, where 73% comes from coal and lignite mining. Therefore, a transition to net zero following India's net zero targets will mean eventual closures of mine and thermal power plants in the state and a shift from oil and gas towards clean mobility solutions, impacting the overall state finances and its people and a lot of the welfare schemes at the state. To manage these impacts on the budget and the overall development agenda, it becomes important to understand what is going to be the cost of transition to the state of Jharkhand. In addition to the cost, to the actual cost of transition for labor or for asset, it also includes budgetary support that is provided by fossil fuels to meet the state's operating budget. Any subsidies provided to poor and marginalized household, including for LPG, including for electricity. Any government or led state government led social sector schemes such as the midday meal, any midday meal program, any health insurance or food assistance. Now, this requires understanding of what is the current expenditure in the budget, in the state budget, which is dependent on fossil fuels, identifying alternate revenue sources, designing a climate finance framework that will help the government meet this investment gap. This is just something that we have designed for the government of Jharkhand to understand how to conduct or how to build a climate resilient framework. The reason for this is apart from understanding the cost of transition and what is the total, say, components in the budget that are directly linked to fossil fuel based revenues, more often than not, we need to provide a climate finance framework to meet the investment needs. Now, what do I mean by a climate finance framework? Essentially, the broad contours of the different areas of funding was what I discussed previously. Now, of these different areas or different avenues to raise money, states can directly access the bond market. But what often ends up happening when states access the bond market is the KPIs that are linked to for investors to invest in these bonds. These KPIs often determine what is the fiscal support at the state level, or what is the revenues that the state manages to, the net revenues that the state has at the end of the at the end of a financial year. What is the fiscal deficit within its budget? Now, what ends up happening is some of these KPIs work for states like Maharashtra, Karnataka, Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, which are more industry driven. But some of these KPIs often don't work for states such as Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Bihar, UP, Orissa, where a large portion of your deficit actually comes from trying to provide the basic access to energy, to food, to the local population, which essentially means that from a state level bond market framework, these states often lose out to some of the better performing states. Um, Again, what the reason why we also need to think about a framework is where the money is going to go. Now, if we need to put, for example, set up a thermal a solar plant similar to say Pavagada in Karnataka, right? Now, a lot of this is project-based funding, which can either come from debt or equity sources, depending on the company that's setting this up. But the hole that we'll see in the budget when coal and oil and gas revenues go down often cannot come under what we call a transition linked bond or equity based funding. So these are instruments that, and therefore we need other instruments that will meet this hole. Or if I have to think, or if the state has to think about putting up, training programs for its for the labor in its jurisdiction, or if it has to think of re, re, re rejuvenating the land from coal to other industries. So, when it comes to environment remediation, biodiversity remediation, now these are often funds that the market is unwilling to provide in the tax in the as it stands today. Therefore, we need to think of frameworks that will help divert the capital, existing capital, to some of these sectors which will not actually see money coming in very easily. Um, Given that, how do we then think about creating some of these instruments? So which is your chart on the right? So can we think about identifying green assets and taxonomy? Now India has developed a taxonomy which will soon come into a green taxonomy, which will soon be notified by the Ministry of Finance. Now, this essentially provides incentives for private sector capital mobilization in avenues both from an industrial sector perspective and larger social welfare perspective to invest in some of these sectors. Similarly, what we need to identify what are the green finance instruments that can be applicable at the central level, at the district level, and at the state level. For example, the municipal bonds that SEBI has recently notified. Now, in a district like, say, Indore or Mumbai or Surat, these bonds are very attractive because these are some of the well-performing districts. But the need for these bond is also felt in some of the poor performing district in the central and the eastern part of the countries, but their KPIs may not necessarily align. So what is the green finance instruments or frameworks that can allow some of these national and global finance and their avenues to be targeted towards area where they actually need to be targeted towards, right? um, so this essentially gives you a very broad idea of what are some of the impediments to climate finance and what are some of the avenues that we will need to start thinking about when we think about climate finance at the central level, at the state level, and at the district level. Um, I'm my presentation will be over in 10 minutes, so very happy to take questions. And then we come to the last part of it, which is the transport sector. Now, India is one of the largest automobile producers in the world, with producing about 22 million vehicles during FY22. Globally, the country is the fourth largest producer of passenger and commercial vehicles after China, US, and Japan. Two-wheelers account for the largest share of automobile industry with close to 77% market share in FY22. Now, the automobile sector contributes one third to the manufacturing GDP and is a key driver of economic growth in the country. India is also a major exporter of vehicles and auto components. Among vehicles, the major export segments include passenger cars, commercial vehicles, two-wheelers, three-wheelers, and quadricycle. According to CM, amongst all automobile segments, commercial vehicles grew the strongest in FY22. This was followed by passenger vehicles. Two-wheeler accounted for the largest export share at 80%, with 4.43 million tons, followed by passenger cars with 10%. Now, this gives you a very broad landscape of the automobile sector in India. From a transition perspective, why this is important. Now, let's look at the electric vehicles. Now, as of 2022, India has around 2 million electric vehicles, which is less than 1% of the 291 million vehicles used across the country. 25 states and union territories have notified EV policies. 4 states and union territories have drafted EV policy. Um, we also conducted an analysis to show that if these targets are met across every segment, what is going to be the impact in terms of electric vehicles. So, as you will see on the graph on the left, there will be a considerable jump in electric vehicles, putting together the targets of all the states. Now, an analysis showed that if we were to assume that these targets are met, then the share of EVs across all segment increases. Even if these targets are not met, based on the IA scenarios, EV sales share across all modes is about 30% in 2030, and in the stated policy scenario, and close to 47% in the announced policy pledges scenario, which follows a net zero trajectory. Now, this essentially means that there is going to be an impact on the way the domestic industry is structured, the battery requirement that we are going to see when it comes to EVs, and the mineral requirement for batteries, for battery production. From the reason, let's tackle the first idea. The first idea is going to be, why are we thinking about industries that are the change in the industries. As we saw in the previous slide, the 10 billion, India earns about $10 billion on an annual basis from export of automobiles. Now, every country that we export to already has in place EV policies, which will see the share of our automobile exports going down between now and the middle of the next decade. Um, Securing supply chains for clean energy transitions, which is essentially the chart on the left. When we think of domestic policy and even our domestic targets, the increase in battery requirement is going to see necessity for us to think about securing our supply chain. Now, this has received increasing focus over the last few years. Several countries, such as the US, EU, Norway, Japan, have already notified a critical mineral list. As you can see from the chart on the left, when it comes to producing batteries for both EVs and storage, we need lithium, nickel, cobalt, copper, manganese, and graphite. Largely, these lithium, nickel, cobalt, copper, and rare earth are broadly classified as critical minerals. Of course, the list of critical minerals depends on the country depends on every country. India is in the process of creating our list of critical minerals, but what it essentially tells you that, as you can see from the chart on the right, while 74% of global lithium end use now comes exclusively from batteries, um, this now needs to be merged with our demand, our domestic demand for each of the minerals from the chart on the left. Um, what we Going forward, what we are going to see is a large portion of what determines energy security. The entire paradigm will end up seeing a shift from a supply chain perspective, given that the amount of critical minerals that are used in new technologies are much, much higher as compared to the minerals that are utilized today in fossil fuel based technologies. From a transport sector perspective, it becomes extremely important for us to consider how the changing both domestic as well as global policies on transport will impact our industries. Now, what we realize is that 85% of India's automotive trade spans 59 countries. 68% of trading partners are in the global south. Brazil, Indonesia, South Africa, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia are both global south and G20 countries. Other G20 trading partners include USA, Mexico, Canada in North America, France, Germany, Italy, UK in Europe, Australia, Japan in the east. 33 of the 59 countries that are India's automotive partners have some EV ambition or target that is already set for the period between 2030 and 2035. This is either as part of their NDC submissions to the UNFCCC, or it is part of their domestic target. Um, Now, as key countries amongst India's automotive export partners transition by 2035, we will also have to manufacture and export EVs that are competitive on both price and technology. This necessitates investment in domestic supply chain. What we end up finding that 13 countries of the 59 export partners have availability of critical minerals, have an EV sale or ambition and target, and most have domestic battery manufacturing production capacity. They account for half of India's automotive exports across passenger vehicles, commercial vehicles, and two wheelers. Now, 20 countries that are key competitors to India's automotive export across the three automotive segments include Japan, North America, and Europe. Both have cell and EV manufacturing. Now, this essentially tries to give you a lay of the landscape that as transitions happen within the transport sector, there is going to be an impact on our exports. But what we can end up doing is this. What we can end up doing is set up and create something like an emerging economies collective. Now, what is this? This is a strategic alliance of emerging economies in the global south that are resource rich, that have an automotive supply chain, that have developed an automotive supply chain. Now, this will basically mean that if we think about it from a strategic perspective, um, this alliance helps India become a leader. It ensures that not only do we have a market access, we also have security of raw material production for EVs, which also then reduces our domestic and international investment risk. What it also means that this alliance together can start thinking about creating a global benchmarking standard on critical minerals. On the trade perspective, the can we use some of our free trade agreements, some of the bilateral agreements that we have with different countries, to understand how we can tweak these to think of a barter system. Very, this is a very simplistic example, but our exports to Indonesia over here essentially are two-wheeler passenger vehicles and commercial vehicles. Now, Indonesia is very rich from its nickel deposits. Therefore, can our trade agreement with Indonesia feature a possibility of a barter system that looks at passenger vehicles for nickel, which can then be processed in India and used for our domestic supply chain, right? The last idea is to look at it from a domestic policy perspective. Right now, for example, when we think of electric vehicles or battery production, the jurisdiction is split between three or four different ministries. So then can we have an interministerial that thinks about putting together, linking some of our manufacturing policies to our mining policies. This kind of holistic policy approach in particular sectors will help ensure the security of the supply chain from India as we transition from coal and oil and gas or a fossil fuel based economy to a more clean energy economy. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much. Very
Thank you very
happy to.
much, ma'am, for this wonderful and quite informative talk. I can't see any question from the audience. My
Yeah.
research is on energy. I have a lot to discuss with you, but it's like the other speakers are already in the queue. So I have to end this, and I will send you my question over the email.
No problem.
Is that
Thank
okay?
you.
Is that okay? Thank you very much, ma'am.
I'm also interested in asking a question, but I will send you through email, ma'am.
Yeah. I will forward that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.